Hey there, welcome to Quiet History. And tonight, it's colder than usual. You're sleeping in this room. There's no fireplace, no heating, and the cold is already setting in. You can see your breath in the air. Your hands are freezing, and that small candle beside you, it barely makes a difference. This is what winter felt like in medieval times. So how did people actually survive this? Night after night.
The ice formed on the inside of the walls, not on the outside, where any reasonable person might expect it, where the wind drove snow against the limestone in long, hissing sheets, and the temperature dropped to depths that had no name in the language of the peasants who endured it. On the inside, on the walls of the room where 6 human beings slept, pressed together like animals in a burrow, where a fire burned through the night, on a flat stone pit in the center of the earthen floor, where breath and bodies and burning wood conspired to produce what passed in January of 1317 for warmth. The frost crept down from the ceiling in the hours before dawn, crystallizing on the rough-cut limestone in delicate, indifferent patterns, beautiful in the way that only genuinely dangerous things can be beautiful. Aldrich woke before the frost reached the floor. He always did. 34 years of winters had trained his body to surface from sleep at the precise moment when the fire's heat had dissipated enough to become a threat rather than a comfort. Some animal instinct calibrated by survival to recognize the difference between cold that was merely miserable and cold that would kill. He lay still for a moment in the darkness, his breath rising in thick, visible clouds above his face, and listened to the sounds of the cottage. The slow, labored breathing of his wife Margot pressed against his left side, the small, quick breaths of his children tangled around and between them, the wet, rattling cough from the far edge of the pallet, where his mother Elspeth lay curled with the 2 dogs pressed against her back. The cough was worse than it had been the night before. He noted this the way a man notes a crack in a load-bearing beam, with a careful, controlled attention that does not yet permit itself to become fear. He rose. The earthen floor beneath his bare feet was not merely cold, but actively hostile, a surface that seemed to draw heat out of his body with purposeful malice. The frozen ground conducting cold upward through the soles of his feet and into his legs with an efficiency that no fire could fully counter. He crossed the 6 steps to the hearth in the darkness he knew as well as daylight, crouching over the stone pit where the previous night's fire had collapsed into a heap of grey ash with a few orange coals still breathing faintly at its center. He worked with the practiced economy of a man who has performed this ritual 10,000 times, clearing ash from the coals with cupped hands, feeding the embers with the smallest, driest scraps of wood saved specifically for this purpose, bending low to blow a long, steady breath across the coals until they brightened and the first small flame appeared. The smoke came before the warmth always did. It rose from the rekindled fire in grey billows, spreading outward and upward toward the hole in the thatched roof that served as the cottage's only ventilation, a gap perhaps 2 feet across, positioned directly above the hearth, through which the smoke was theoretically meant to escape. In practice, the smoke did what smoke does. It filled the space available to it, pooling in the upper half of the room, inner, permanent, shifting haze that stung the eyes and coated the lungs and left every surface in the cottage, the walls, the rough wooden shelf, the hanging bundles of dried herbs with a dark, greasy film that had been accumulating for years. The family slept low because of this. Everyone in the village slept low. The air near the floor was breathable. The air at standing height, in the worst of the smoke, was not. This was not a choice or a preference. It was physics, and physics in 1317 was not negotiable. The cottage measured perhaps 20 feet by 15, roughly the dimensions of a modest modern living room, and it contained, in addition to the 6 human beings and 2 dogs, a low partition at the far end behind which the family's cow, 2 goats, and a pig were housed through the winter months. The smell was something the visitors from another century would find incomprehensible, a dense layering of smoke and animal waste and unwashed bodies, and the particular damp earth smell of a stone floor that never fully dried. To Aldrich and his family, it smelled like home. It smelled like survival. The walls were rough-cut limestone, 2 feet thick in places, which sounded like substantial protection against the cold, until one understood what stone actually does in winter. Stone does not insulate. Stone conducts. The thick walls of Aldrich's cottage were not a barrier against the cold outside, but a reservoir of it. 12 hours of January night had chilled the limestone to its core, and those walls now radiated cold inward into the room with the same patient, relentless energy that a summer stone wall radiates heat. The fire's warmth extended perhaps 4 feet in any direction from the hearth. The corners of the room, 8 or 10 feet from the fire, remained below freezing even when the fire burned well. The frost on the walls was not a failure of the fire. It was a demonstration of geometry. The water bucket near the door had a skin of ice across its surface, perhaps a 1/4 inch thick. Aldrich broke it with his knuckle, without thinking, the gesture automatic, and set the bucket closer to the fire, to thaw. He then turned to assess the wood piles stacked against the interior wall, the precious, diminishing stack of fuel that stood between his family and the cold in its most absolute form. He counted the logs with the grim arithmetic of a man who has learned to think about warmth in units of time. This many logs, this many hours of fire, this many hours of fire, this many hours, until the cold becomes something other than an inconvenience. The winter of 1317 was not an ordinary winter, though ordinary winters in northern France in the early 14th century were already brutal enough to kill. This was the 3rd consecutive year of catastrophic cold and rain that had begun in 1315, when the rains came in spring and did not stop, when the harvest failed across a swath of northern Europe so vast that no local explanation could account for it, when the price of grain rose to levels that meant starvation for anyone without reserves. The Great Famine, people would call it later, though the people living through it had no such organizing name for their suffering. They knew only that the harvests had failed, that the animals were dying, that the children were thin in ways that frightened their parents, that the old people were not surviving winters they had survived before. The medieval warm period, 3 centuries of relatively mild temperatures that had allowed European agriculture to expand northward, that had fed the population growth of the High Middle Ages, that had made possible the great cathedrals and the expanding cities, had ended. What replaced it was not immediately named or understood, but its effects were immediate and devastating. Shorter growing seasons, wetter summers, Harder winters, a cascade of agricultural failure that had been grinding down the population of Northern Europe for 2 years and would continue for 7 more. Aldrich did not know any of this in the terms that historians would later use to describe it. He knew that his mother's cough was worse than last year's cough, and that last year's cough had killed old Renaud's wife before February. Margot stirred as the fire grew, her dark eyes opening to find Aldrich crouched at the hearth in the growing light of the flames. She did not speak. There was a language between them that required no words, built from years of shared survival, and what passed between them in that moment was a complete exchange. The assessment of the fire, the state of the woodpile, the sound of Elspeth's breathing, the temperature of the room, the day's requirements. She pulled the rough wool blanket more tightly around the children, 3 of them, ranging from 4 to 9 years old, still deeply asleep in the boneless way of children who have not yet learned to monitor their own survival, and rose to begin the morning's work. The sleeping arrangement was not accidental. Aldrich and Margot occupied the center of the straw pallet, their bodies the warmest point in the human cluster, radiating heat outward to the children pressed against them on both sides. Elspeth lay at the edge, which should have been the coldest position, but the 2 dogs, large, rough-coated animals, whose body heat was a genuine and valued contribution to the household's thermal economy, were pressed against her back and legs, their combined warmth compensating for her peripheral position. The youngest child, 4-year-old Perrette, slept tucked between her parents' bodies, the most protected position because Perrette was the most vulnerable, and this was understood without discussion. This was thermal engineering, medieval style, sophisticated, empirical, and born entirely of necessity. From across the room, Elspeth's cough came again, deeper now, wetter, with a quality that made Margot's hands pause briefly in their work before continuing. The old woman was 61 years old, which was not ancient by any absolute measure, but was genuinely old for a peasant woman who had spent 6 decades breathing smoke and cold and the particular damp of stone cottages in northern France. Her lungs had been compromised for years by the smoke that was the inevitable companion of every fire that kept her alive. The cold sickness, what a later century would recognize as pneumonia, or perhaps a combination of pneumonia and the chronic bronchitis that was nearly universal among people who spent their lives in smoky rooms, had settled into her chest in November and had been deepening ever since. There was no treatment for it, not in any meaningful sense. There was warmth, which was insufficient. There was broth, which required fuel to make, and ingredients they could barely spare. There was the healer's knowledge, which was genuine and hard-won, and ultimately helpless against what was happening in the old woman's lungs. And there was the family's presence, the warmth of bodies pressed close, the sound of breathing in the darkness, the knowledge that she was not alone in the cold. Dawn arrived, not as relief, but as a grey, indifferent revelation. The thin light that filtered through the oiled membrane, covering the cottage's single narrow window slit, showed the room in its full winter reality, the frost on the upper walls, catching the pale light in cold sparkles, the smoke haze hanging at head height, the animals moving restlessly in their partition, the children beginning to stir with the particular reluctance of small bodies that know, instinctively, that the world outside the blanket is hostile. Through the door's gaps, visible streams of cold air moved like slow water across the frozen floor. Aldrich pulled on his outer layer, a rough wool tunic over the one he had slept in, then a sheepskin vest with the wool turned inward, and moved to the door. He opened it onto a world that was white and grey, and absolutely, mercilessly cold. The kind of cold that enters the lungs like a physical substance, that makes the skin of the face tighten immediately, that communicates without ambiguity that it will kill anything it can reach. The woodpile against the exterior wall was smaller than he had calculated in the darkness. The livestock pen beyond showed no movement through its gap, and his first fear that the cold had taken one of the animals in the night resolved into relief when he heard the cow shift inside. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, his breath rising in great white clouds, looking at the frozen world that was his life. The village beyond was just beginning to show signs of life, a thread of smoke from a neighbour's roof, the distant sound of an animal, the creak of a door. Everyone was performing the same morning ritual, the same desperate calculus of fuel and food and warmth, the same assessment of who had made it through the night and what the day would cost them. He turned back inside, pulling the door closed against the cold, and met Margot's eyes across the dim, smoky room. Behind her, Elspeth coughed again, long and wet and deep, and the sound filled the cottage and hung in the smoke-thickened air like a question that no one yet had the answer to. The fire needed wood. The children needed feeding. The day, indifferent to everything they had already endured, and everything still ahead, had begun. Stone does not forgive. It does not yield to warmth, does not soften toward the bodies pressed against it, does not remember summer. It simply holds the cold, patient and absolute, and gives it back. Margot understood this, the way she understood her own heartbeat, not as knowledge acquired, but as knowledge lived, pressed into her body through 31 winters in rooms made of limestone and desperation. She understood it in her feet first, every morning, when she rose from the straw pallet and placed her soles against the earthen floor and felt the cold climb her legs like something with intention. The floor was not merely cold. It was a conduit, packed earth that had frozen solid in the deep weeks of January, conducting cold upward from the ground beneath with the same patient efficiency as the walls conducted it inward from outside. Standing on it for any length of time, without the thick rags wrapped around their feet, was not discomfort. It was damage, slow and cumulative, the kind that settled into joints and never fully left. She wrapped her feet first, always. 2 layers of rough wool cloth, then a strip of cured hide tied at the ankle. Not shoes in any sense that a later century would recognize, but a barrier between her skin and the frozen ground that made the difference between function and incapacity. Then she moved through the cottage in the growing firelight, and through her eyes the room revealed itself in its full, unsparing reality. The walls were the first fact of the cottage, the condition that preceded everything else. 2 feet thick in places, the limestone blocks had been laid by hands that were long dead, mortared with a mixture of lime and sand that had cracked and crumbled in the years since, leaving gaps that Margot had filled and refilled with whatever came to hand: mud, straw, a paste made from ash and animal fat that hardened briefly before the freeze-thaw cycles of winter worked it loose again. The thickness of the walls was not protection. This was the central cruel irony of stone construction in cold climates, the fact that looked like safety and functioned as its opposite. 2 feet of limestone held cold, the way a mill pond holds water, deeply, completely, releasing it slowly and steadily into the room throughout the night and the grey morning hours, so that the walls themselves became radiators of cold, working against every effort the fire made to warm the air between them. She ran her hand along the interior surface near the door, where the frost had formed in the night, and felt the limestone's deep, bone-level chill against her palm. The frost was already retreating as the fire grew, but the cold in the stone itself would not retreat. It would simply wait, storing the next night's cold as the day progressed, ready to release it again when the fire burned low. The walls were not shelter from winter. They were winter's accomplice, wearing the disguise of shelter. The roof above her was thatched with rye straw, laid in thick overlapping layers by the same long-dead hands that had mortared the walls, and it was, of all the cottage's elements, the one that came closest to genuine insulation. Straw trapped air, and trapped air resisted cold, and so the thatch provided a layer of thermal resistance that the stone walls entirely lacked. But the thatch was also alive in ways that complicated its usefulness. Rats moved through it in the night, their small bodies audible in the rustling overhead, their tunnels creating channels through which cold air moved freely. Insects had colonized it through the warmer months, and now lay dormant in its depths. Moisture had penetrated it in the autumn rains, and the wet straw had compressed and shifted, leaving gaps where wind found entry. Thin, knife-edged currents of cold air that descended from the ceiling in places Margot had mapped through years of living beneath them. Cold spots that moved with the wind direction, that could be felt as a sudden chill on the back of the neck or the top of a sleeping child's head. The smoke vent, the gap in the thatch above the central hearth, was both the cottage's lungs and one of its primary vulnerabilities. Without it, the smoke from the fire would have filled the room entirely within minutes, driving the family out into the cold, or killing them where they lay. With it, the smoke rose and escaped, but the gap that allowed smoke to exit also allowed cold to enter, and wind to enter, and rain and snow to enter when the weather drove them sideways. On windy nights, the vent became a bellows, drawing cold air down into the room and disrupting the fire's draft, filling the lower air with smoke that should have risen and escaped. There was no solution to this. It was the fundamental compromise of the open hearth system, the price paid for breathable air, and every family in every cottage in the village paid it every night of every winter. The door was a plank of rough-cut oak, iron-banded, hung on leather hinges that had stiffened in the cold and required effort to move. On the inside, an animal hide, the cured skin of a goat that had died 2 winters past, hung from a wooden rod above the doorframe, serving as a draught curtain, a secondary barrier against the cold air that poured through the door's gaps when the wind blew from the north. Margot had watched those gaps on bad nights, seen the cold air moving through them in visible streams, when the fire's smoke was low enough to make the air currents visible. Thin rivers of winter flowing across the floor, pooling in the corners, sliding under the edges of the sleeping pallet. The hide curtain caught some of this. Not enough. Never enough. Where windows might have been, in a different kind of house, in a different kind of world, there were narrow slits cut through the limestone, not for light or view, but for the minimum ventilation that kept the smoke from becoming immediately lethal. These slits were covered with wooden shutters in winter, which blocked the cold, but also blocked all light, leaving the cottage in a dimness that was barely relieved by the fire's glow. In better weather, the shutters were replaced with frames stretched with oiled animal membrane, pig bladder or sheep intestine, scraped thin and translucent, that admitted a grey diffuse light while providing some resistance to wind. In January, the membrane had been replaced by the shutters, and the cottage existed in a permanent half-darkness that was the visual equivalent of the cold. Pervasive, inescapable, the natural condition of the season. This was Aldrich's cottage. It was not the worst house in the village, and it was not the best. It was a peasant's house, built to the standards, and with the materials available to people who had no margin for improvement, and it represented the thermal reality of perhaps 90% of the human beings alive in Northern Europe in January of 1317. A short walk through the village revealed the variations on this theme. The craftsman's house, belonging to the village's carpenter, a man named Thomas, whose skill with wood had earned him a marginally better life than the field labourers, was timber-framed, its walls filled with wattle and daub, a lattice of woven branches, plastered with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung that had dried to a hard, pale surface. This construction, counterintuitively, performed better against cold than Aldrich's stone walls. The daub mixture trapped small air pockets within its matrix, providing genuine if modest insulation, and the timber frame allowed for slightly tighter construction at the joints than rough-cut limestone permitted. Thomas's house was still bitterly cold by any modern standard, but it was measurably less cold than the stone cottages, and in winter, measurement was everything. Beyond the craftsman's house, at the edge of the village, the manor house of the local lord presented what should have been a different world entirely. It had a fireplace, a genuine fireplace, built into the wall with a stone chimney that carried smoke up and out rather than allowing it to pool in the living space. This was a genuine technological advancement over the central hearth, and the lord's household understood it as such, as a mark of status as much as comfort. But the great hall of the manor house was also vast, 30 feet high at the peak, with a floor area that could have contained Aldrich's entire cottage a dozen times over, and the single fireplace at one end, however efficiently it drew, could not warm that volume of air to any temperature that a later century would consider habitable. The lord sat near the fire in furs and wool, and the far end of his hall was as cold as the outdoors, and the servants who slept on the hall floor near the walls woke to frost on their blankets, just as Aldrich's family did. It was in the monastery 3 miles from the village that the architecture of cold found its most articulate witness. Brother Anselm, a monk of 50 years who had spent 3 decades in the monastery's scriptorium, kept a journal in which he recorded the daily reality of monastic life with the precise, unsentimental eye of a man trained to observe and transcribe. His entries from January of 1317 described the ink freezing in its pot before he could complete a line, requiring him to hold the inkwell against his body to thaw it sufficiently to write. He described the stone floor of the chapel at morning prayers, the monks required to kneel on bare limestone that had been absorbing cold all night, the pain of it moving from discomfort to genuine agony. Within minutes, several of the older brothers, unable to rise without assistance. He described his own fingers, wrapped in strips of wool between writing sessions, the tips cracked and bleeding from the cold and the dryness, the skin split at the knuckles in wounds that would not heal because the cold prevented healing. The monastery had a kale factory, a warming room, the single heated space in the entire complex where the monks were permitted to gather briefly during the day to restore feeling to their extremities before returning to their duties. Brother Anselm wrote about the kale factory with a longing that was almost devotional, the warmth of it described in his careful Latin, with the same reverence he applied to the divine offices. The warming room was not warm by any absolute measure. It was simply less cold than everywhere else, and in that relative warmth, hands uncurled and colour returned to faces, and the monks remembered, briefly, what it felt like to exist in a body that was not in constant negotiation with the cold. The monastery also practiced the sharing of beds, not from any failure of propriety, but from the same thermal logic that governed every other aspect of winter survival. 2 monks to a bed, their combined body heat making the difference between a night of miserable cold and a night of survivable cold. In the manor house, the Lord's servants warmed his bed before he retired, climbing between the sheets with their own bodies, lying there until the linen had absorbed enough human heat to be bearable, then withdrawing to their own cold corners. Metal bed, warmers, pans of hammered iron, or copper filled with hot coals from the fire, slid between the sheets on long handles, or a luxury of the moderately prosperous, a technology that represented the period's most sophisticated attempt to bring warmth to the place where the body was most vulnerable. In Aldrich's cottage, the bed warmer was a heated stone, wrapped in cloth, placed at the foot of the pallet before sleep, warm for perhaps an hour before the cold reclaimed it. Margot found the gap in the wall, mid-morning, in the corner behind the wooden shelf where the family's few clay vessels were stored. The daub she had applied in November, a mixture of mud and straw pressed into a crack where the mortar had crumbled, had failed, worked loose by the freeze-thaw cycling of the walls, and the gap was now wide enough to admit a finger. She could feel the cold air moving through it, a thin, steady exhalation of winter into the room, and she pressed her palm against it and felt the temperature differential with a clarity that needed no instrument to measure. She gathered what she had, a bucket of mud from the pile, kept near the hearth for exactly this purpose, a handful of straw, the knowledge accumulated through years of patching and repatching the same walls through the same cycles of damage. She worked the mixture with her hands, cold even near the fire, her fingers stiff and reluctant, and pressed it into the gap with the careful attention of someone who understood that this repair would not hold. Time equals sign, 900 milliseconds. The freeze-thaw cycle would work it loose again within days, perhaps within hours, if the temperature dropped sharply tonight. The mud would crack, the straw would pull free, and the gap would open again, and she would patch it again, and the wall would reject the patch again, and this cycle would continue until spring made it irrelevant, and summer made it forgotten, and autumn brought the same crumbling mortar, and the same cold air, and the same handful. of mud and straw. She pressed the patch flat with her palm and held it there for a moment, feeling the cold of the stone through the mud, feeling the wall's indifference to her effort. From across the room, Elspeth coughed, the deep, wet sound that had become the cottage's unwanted rhythm, and the children looked up from their tasks with the careful, measuring attention of children who have learned to read adult faces for information about danger. Margot smoothed the patch one final time and turned back to the fire. The mud would not hold. She knew this with the certainty of long experience, the way she knew the cold would return tonight, and the woodpile would be smaller tomorrow, and the winter would continue its patient, architectural assault on every barrier she could raise against it. She knew it, and she patched the wall anyway, because it was all she had, and all she had was always going to have to be enough. A man who cannot count his wood cannot survive winter. This was not wisdom passed down in proverbs or recorded in any document that would survive the centuries. It was simply true, the way freezing was true, the way hunger was true, a fact so fundamental that it required no articulation among people who lived inside it every day. Aldrich camped at his woodpile on the morning of the 14th day of January, standing in the grey pre-dawn cold, with his breath rising in white clouds and his eyes moving over the stacked logs, with the focused attention of a man performing a calculation which lives depend. He counted slowly, touching each log, grouping them in his mind by size and density. The larger pieces of elm that would burn for hours, the smaller split sections of birch that caught quickly and burned hot but briefly, the bundle of dried bracken that would serve as kindling and nothing more. He counted and he calculated, and the calculation produced a number that he stood with for a long moment in the cold, not moving, letting the full weight of it settle into him before he allowed himself to think about what it meant. 3 weeks, perhaps 3 weeks of fuel if the family burned conservatively, if they let the fire drop lower at night and was comfortable, if they supplemented the wood with dried dung from the animals, if they burned the bracken bundles during the day when the fire needed only to maintain rather than generate heat. 3 weeks of fuel, and at least 6 weeks of hard winter remaining. The gap between those two numbers was not a problem to be solved. It was a sentence written in cold arithmetic, and the only question was how it would be served. He went to find Renaud. Renaud was his neighbour in the most literal medieval sense, the man whose cottage shared a wall with Aldrich's, whose fields abutted his in the open strip system of the village's agricultural land, whose family survival was bound to Aldrich's by proximity and necessity and the long habit of mutual dependence. He was 40 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had been shaped by decades of field labour into something that looked less like human anatomy than like tools, thick-fingered, scarred, permanently darkened by soil and smoke. His wife had died the previous February, the cold sickness, taking her in the same wet, rattling way it was now working on Elspeth, and he had spent the winter alone with his 2 surviving children, which meant he understood the arithmetic of fuel with the same grim precision as Aldrich. They did not discuss the plan at length. There was not much to discuss. The forest was 2 miles from the village, and the forest belonged to the Lord, and taking wood from the Lord's forest without permission was theft, and theft of this kind was punishable under forest law, with penalties that had been designed specifically to be memorable. A hand removed at the wrist, in the worst cases, or the loss of fingers, or blinding, or worse, depending on the Lord's mood and the forester's report, and the season's politics. These were not abstract possibilities. Everyone in the village knew someone who had paid one of these prices, or knew someone who knew someone, and the knowledge lived in the community the way all important knowledge lives, not as information, but as a felt understanding, a physical awareness of consequence that shaped behavior without requiring conscious deliberation. They went anyway. They went because the alternative to the risk of mutilation was the certainty of freezing, and between those two outcomes, the risk was the rational choice. This was the coal's most insidious power. Not that it killed directly, but that it narrowed the space of possible action until the only choices remaining were bad ones, and then it forced a selection among them. The forest in January was a different world from the forest of summer or even autumn. The snow had come in the night, 4 inches of it lying clean and white over everything, and the trees stood in their winter configurations, bare branches of oak and ash and beech making dark lacework against the pale sky, the evergreen stands of pine holding their snow in heavy clumps that fell without warning in soft explosions when the wind moved through the upper branches. The silence was absolute in the way that only winter forest silence is absolute. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of a quiet so deep and complete that it had texture, that it pressed against the ears and made the small sounds of 2 men moving through snow. The crunch of footsteps, the rasp of breath, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot seemed almost obscenely loud. They moved carefully, not because careful movement was quieter, but because the snow recorded everything. Their tracks followed them like evidence, 2 lines of boot prints in the white surface, readable to anyone who came after them as clearly as a written account. Break, time equal sign, 900 milliseconds. The forester, a man named Gilles, known in the village as thorough and humorless, and not susceptible to the kind of informal arrangements that sometimes smoothed these situations, was understood to patrol, even in deep winter, precisely because deep winter was when desperation drove people into the forest. He knew the arithmetic of fuel, as well as anyone. He knew what the woodpiles looked like in January, and he knew what that meant about where people would go. They found the fallen oak a 1/4 mile into the forest, where a storm the previous autumn had brought down a tree of magnificent size, a trunk perhaps 3 feet across. At the base, its crown collapsed into a tangle of branches that spread across 30 feet of forest floor, the whole thing now buried under the new snow in a long white mound that looked almost peaceful. The tree was dead. It had been dead since the storm, its wood already beginning the slow process of seasoning that would eventually make it ideal fuel. Dry, dense, burning hot, and long with minimal smoke. It was also, without question, the Lord's property. A dead tree on the Lord's land was the Lord's dead tree, and the forest law was explicit on this point, in ways that left no room for the argument that the tree was already fallen, already dead, already doing no one any good lying in the snow. Aldrich and Renaud stood at the edge of the fallen crown and looked at each other across the white mound of the tree. The look contained the entire argument, the risk, the need, the calculation, the decision, and it lasted perhaps 3 seconds before they both moved toward the tree and began to work. They worked with axes, and the two men saw their tools carried from the village, wrapped in cloth to muffle any sound of metal against metal. The work was hard in the cold. The wood was partially frozen, the saw binding in the cut, the axe requiring more force than summer work demanded, because the cold had stiffened both the wood and the men wielding the tools. Their breath came in great clouds, their bodies generating heat through effort that their clothing struggled to contain, sweat building under the wool layers in the particular misery of winter labor, too cold to be comfortable, too warm from exertion to be properly dressed for the temperature, the sweat cooling rapidly whenever they paused and threatening the kind of chill that could become dangerous on the walk home. They worked in near silence, communicating through gesture and the coordinated rhythm of the two-man saw, both of them listening beneath the sounds of their own labor for anything that did not belong to the forest. The crack of a branch, the sound of footsteps in snow, the particular silence that falls when a human presence enters a space and the forest adjusts to it. They listened for Gilles the forester with the focused attention of men who understood exactly what his appearance would mean. The wood they cut was not the best of what the fallen oak offered. They took the outer branches, smaller diameter, easier to cut and carry, less obviously removed from the main trunk, and left the great bole of the tree as undisturbed as they could manage, hoping that the snow would cover their work before any patrol came through. This was the peasant's calculus of theft. Take enough to survive, not so much that the taking is unmistakable. Leave the evidence as ambiguous as possible, and trust that a forester who finds a few branches missing from a fallen tree in deep winter has better things to do than pursue the matter aggressively. The medieval hierarchy of fuel was a precise social document, encoding in the question of who burned what the entire structure of the society's power relations. At the top, the lord burned seasoned hardwood, oak and ash, and beech, cut from the best trees in the forest, split and stacked to dry through the summer, burned in the manor's fireplace with the casual abundance of someone who has never had to count logs. Below him, the craftsmen and the more prosperous peasants burned whatever hardwood they could legally obtain through the system of wood rights, the carefully negotiated permissions that allowed certain people to take certain amounts of wood from certain parts of the forest under certain conditions, the bureaucracy of fuel that reflected the period's obsessive attention to the management of scarce resources. At the bottom, the poorest peasants burned what they could gather, find or steal, green wood that produced more smoke than heat and left a thick creosote build-up in the thatch above the hearth, dried animal dung that burned with a low, acrid heat and a smell that permeated everything it touched, peat cut from the bogs in autumn and stacked to dry, slow burning, steady, and available to those who had access to bogland. Bundles of bracken and gorse burned fast and fierce, consuming themselves in minutes, useful for starting a fire or for a quick burst of heat, but hopeless as a primary fuel. Aldrich burned all of these things in whatever combination the season provided. They loaded the cut wood onto the rough sledge they had dragged from the village, a flat platform of planks on wooden runners designed for exactly this kind of transport across snow, and began the 2-mile return journey. The sledge was heavy, the two men leaning into the drag ropes with their full weight, their boots finding purchase in the snow with effort. They did not speak. The forest moved around them in its winter silence, and they moved through it as quickly as they could, and the tracks they left in the snow were a record of everything they had done, readable by anyone who came after them. It was on the return journey that Aldrich saw the other tracks. They crossed the path perhaps 100 yards from where the fallen oak lay, bootprints in the snow, a single set, moving perpendicular to their own trail. Fresh prints, the edges still crisp, the snow in the bottom of each impression undisturbed by wind. Recent, perhaps an hour old, perhaps less. He stopped, and Renaud stopped beside him, and they both looked at the tracks without speaking, reading them with the attention that people who live close to consequence bring to signs and evidence. The prints were the right size for a man of Jules' build. They moved in the direction of the fallen oak. They did not discuss this either. They picked up the drag ropes and moved faster, and did not look back. The fire itself, the thing all this risk and labour served, was not the simple, romantic symbol that later centuries would make of it. It was a technical problem, and medieval people approached it with the expertise of those for whom failure was not an inconvenience, but a death sentence. The correct construction of a fire for a central hearth required knowledge that was transmitted through generations with the same seriousness as any other survival skill. The fire dogs, iron irons that lifted the burning wood off the stone surface, allowing air to circulate beneath and feed the combustion from below, were among the most important pieces of equipment a peasant family owned, more valuable in practical terms than almost anything else in the cottage. Wood placed directly on stone smothered its own fire. Wood elevated on iron burned cleanly and hot. Banking the fire for the night was an art. The coals were covered with a deep layer of ash, not smothered, but insulated, the ash acting as a thermal blanket that preserved the heat of the coals through the night without allowing them to burn through their fuel. A correctly banked fire could hold live coals for 8 hours or more, providing the morning's starting point and saving the ordeal of relighting from cold. A poorly banked fire went out, and relighting it with flint and steel in freezing temperatures, with fingers too numb to feel the steel properly, was an ordeal that could take an hour of increasingly desperate effort, an hour during which the room grew colder and the family's bodies paid the price of the failed fire in ways that accumulated through the winter into the chronic cold stress that killed people slowly from the inside out. Against this possibility, Aldrich kept a clay pot, a simple vessel with a lid, set near the hearth each night, containing live coals buried in ash, a portable reservoir of fire that could restart the hearth if the banking failed. This was fire insurance in its most literal form, the medieval solution to the existential problem of fire loss, and it was treated with the reverence appropriate to something that might, on any given morning, be the difference between a family that survived the day and one that did not. The pot was never left unattended for long. Its coals were checked and refreshed with the regularity of a religious observance, because in a very real sense it was one. A peasant family in deep winter spent 4 to 6 hours each day on fire-related tasks, gathering fuel, the constant, never-finished work of finding and collecting and processing combustible material, processing wood, splitting larger pieces, bundling bracken, drying damp material near the fire's edge, tending the fire, the monitoring and adjustment that kept it burning at the correct rate, neither consuming fuel too fast, nor dropping so low that the room's temperature fell to dangerous levels, managing the smoke, adjusting the draft through the vent, positioning the family's activities to keep them below the worst of the haze, the constant low-level negotiation with combustion that was simply part of the texture of daily life. Fire was not a convenience. It was a full-time occupation shared among everyone in the household old enough to contribute. Aldrich and Renaud reached the village as the light was failing, the short January afternoon collapsing into early dark with the abruptness that always felt like a small violence. They split the wood between them in the lane between their cottages, dividing it with the careful fairness of men who trust each other completely and know that trust is too valuable to risk over a few logs. The extra fuel went into Aldrich's woodpile with a weight that was not merely physical, the weight of risk taken and survived, of the gap between 3 weeks and 6 weeks narrowed, if not closed. Margot met him at the door with a look that asked the question without words, and he answered it the same way. And she stepped back to let him bring the wood inside, and the children watched from the pallet with the large, serious eyes of children who understand more than adults wish they did. Later, when the fire was built up and the family had eaten and the children were asleep, Aldrich sat near the hearth and thought about the tracks in the snow, the forester's prints moving toward the fallen oak, an hour old when they had crossed them. By now, Sheil would have reached the tree, would have seen the fresh cuts in the wood, the disturbed snow, the drag marks of the sledge leading back toward the village, would have read the evidence with the same careful attention that Aldrich had read his tracks. The fire crackled and shifted, settling into its nighttime rhythm. The stolen oak burned with the clean, hot flame of well-seasoned hardwood, and the room was warmer than it had been in days, and Elspeth's breathing from the far pallet was still wet and laboured but present. Still present, still the sound of a woman alive in the cold. Aldrich covered the coals with ash for the night, checked the clay pot, and lay down beside Margot in the dark. The warmth of the extra wood surrounded them like something borrowed, something that might be called in at any moment. Outside, in the snow between the village and the forest, the tracks remained, patient and legible, waiting for morning. Every human body is a furnace burning at 98 degrees, and in the coldest hours of a medieval January night, that heat was not a biological footnote. It was architecture. It was engineering. It was, in the most literal sense available to people who had no other options, the difference between a family that woke in the morning and one that did not. In the hour before dawn, when the fire had burned down to its lowest point and the cold had reached its deepest penetration of the night, the sleeping arrangement in Aldrich's cottage revealed itself as something more than poverty or custom. Aldrich and Margot lay at the center of the straw pallet, their bodies the thermal core of the human cluster, generating and exchanging heat through the simple ancient mechanism of proximity. Against Margot's left side, 9-year-old Thomas was pressed so tightly that his breathing synchronized with hers in the night, his small body drawing warmth from her larger one, with the unself-conscious efficiency of a child who has never known a bed he did not share. On Aldrich's right, 7-year-old Isabel had burrowed her face into the space between his arm and his ribs, her breath warming the wool of his tunic, her feet tangled with her brother's beneath the shared blanket. Between the two adults, tucked into the warmest possible position, the center of the center, the eye of the human storm, 4-year-old Perrette slept with the absolute, boneless abandon of a child who has never had reason to doubt that warmth would be provided. At the pallet's edge, where the cold was most aggressive, Elspeth lay curled in the configuration of someone who has spent decades conserving heat, knees drawn up, arms folded against her chest, her body contracted to minimize the surface area exposed to the air. Against her back, pressed close enough that their breathing moved her hair, the two dogs lay in a tangle of rough fur and animal warmth. They were large dogs, bred for work rather than companionship, their bodies dense with the kind of metabolic heat that working animals generate, and their combined contribution to Elspeth's survival through the night was not sentimental or incidental. It was measurable. It was real. A large dog produces roughly the same heat output as a small child and two large dogs pressed against an elderly woman's back on a January night in an uninsulated stone cottage were the difference between a body temperature that held and one that did not. This arrangement had not been designed by anyone. No one had sat down with a diagram and calculated optimal thermal positioning. It had evolved through generations of winters, through the accumulated transmitted knowledge of families who had learned by surviving and by failing to survive, who had watched the old and the young die in cold and had adjusted their sleeping configurations accordingly, who had arrived at this particular arrangement through a process of empirical refinement that was no less rigorous for being entirely unconscious. The most vulnerable at the center, or against the warmest bodies, the most heat-generating adults at the core, the animals at the periphery, their alien warmth filling the gaps that human bodies could not reach. It was thermal engineering, and it worked, and the people practicing it had no name for what they were doing because they had never known a world in which it was not simply what you did. Beyond the sleeping pallet, behind the low wooden partitions that divided the cottage's single room, the animals contributed their own heat to the household's thermal economy. The cow stood in her narrow space with the patient immobility of a large animal in winter, her body generating heat at a rate that would have astonished anyone who had never thought carefully about bovine metabolism. Oh, a healthy cow in winter produces heat equivalent to a small modern space heater, roughly 500 watts of continuous thermal output radiating from her body into the surrounding air with the steady, reliable generosity of a creature whose size makes her a heat engine of considerable power. The two goats added their smaller but not insignificant contributions, and the pig, a large sow, who had spent the summer converting kitchen scraps and forage into the dense body mass that now served double duty as winter food reserve and heat source, generated warmth from her compact, well-insulated body with a consistency that Aldrich valued as concretely as he valued the woodpile. The smell of this arrangement was something that required no description to anyone who had experienced it, and no description could adequately convey to anyone who had not. It was layered and total. The sharp ammonia of animal urine soaked into the earthen floor, the deeper, warmer smell of large animal bodies, the acrid overlay of smoke, the particular damp organic smell of straw that has been slept on and breathed over and lived in through months of winter. It was the smell of survival, and the family moved through it without awareness, the way people move through the smell of their own lives, because it was simply the air of the place where they were alive. The noise was constant and varied. The cow shifted her weight in the night with slow, deliberate movements that sent vibrations through the partition. The goats moved with the quick, nervous energy of their kind, their hooves on the earthen floor producing small, sharp sounds that punctuated the deeper rhythms of human breathing and the fires settling. The pig was largely still in the cold, her metabolism slowed by the temperature to a patient, heat-conserving torpor that was the animal equivalent of the family's own winter economy. Doing less, burning less, preserving what warmth existed against the demands of the cold. The risk of disease in this arrangement was genuine and understood, in the empirical way that medieval people understood risks they could observe without being able to explain. Animals carried illness that could move to humans, and humans in close proximity to animals through the long winter months were exposed to that transmission in ways that a later century would quantify and name. But the medieval calculus was not complicated. The risk of disease from the animals was a possibility distributed across the winter and uncertain in its outcome. The certainty of cold without the animal's heat was not a risk. It was a sentence, and between a possible future harm and a certain present one, the choice was not difficult. Hilda understood this with a specificity born of loss. She was 23 years old, the youngest daughter of a family that had been reduced by the famine years to herself, her husband, and an infant who had arrived in October with the particular terrible timing of a child born into a winter that would test every resource available to keep it alive. The previous winter, in the confusion of a difficult birth and the chaos of a household reorganizing itself around a new and demanding life, she had failed to bring the family's pig inside before a cold snap dropped the temperature to a depth that the animal could not survive in the outdoor pen. She had found it in the morning, stiff, eyes glazed, the body already cooling toward the ambient temperature of the frozen world around it. The loss of the pig had been a catastrophe measured in multiple currencies simultaneously. The meat had been preserved and eaten, so the immediate food loss was partially recovered. But the pig's heat, the steady, reliable contribution of a large animal's metabolism to the household's thermal balance, was gone, and its absence had been felt through every remaining week of that winter as a cold that was marginally but meaningfully worse than it would otherwise have been. And the pig itself, as a living asset, as a breeding animal, as the foundation of next year's meat supply, was irreplaceable on a budget that had no margin for replacement. The loss echoed forward through time in ways that were still being felt. This winter, Hilda's remaining pig slept inside. It slept inside with a ferocity of intention that her husband found excessive and that Hilda found entirely proportionate to the stakes involved. She checked on the animal before she slept, and when she woke, and at intervals through the night when the cold woke her, pressing her hand against the pig's flank to feel the warmth there, the reliable heat of a living body doing its work. The pig was not a pet. It was not an object of sentiment. It was a heat source and a food reserve and a future, and she tended it with the fierce, unsentimental protectiveness of someone who has learned exactly what its loss costs. The clothing that the family wore through the winter months was itself a thermal system, layered and managed with the same practical expertise that governed every other aspect of cold survival. Wool was the primary material. Rough, undyed wool from the village's sheep, spun and woven into cloth that was heavy and scratchy and possessed of the remarkable property of retaining some insulating capacity even when wet, a characteristic that distinguished it from every other available material and made it, in the cold and damp of northern European winters, genuinely life-saving. The family wore their wool in layers. A base layer slept in and worked in, a second layer added for outdoor work, a third layer of heavier cloth or animal fur for the coldest conditions. The layering was not fashion. It was thermodynamics, the trapping of air between layers creating insulation that no single thick garment could match. The feet were the most critical and most vulnerable point in this system. The frozen ground conducted cold upward through the soles with relentless efficiency, and feet that were inadequately protected lost heat faster than the body could replace it, drawing warmth away from the core, in a process that could progress from discomfort to frostbite, to gangrene with a speed that the medieval record documented in the amputations and deaths that clustered in the coldest months. The family wrapped their feet in multiple layers of wool cloth, then covered them with pieces of cured hide, tied at the ankle, crude, effective, requiring constant attention, because wet wrappings against cold skin were worse than no wrappings at all, the moisture accelerating heat loss and creating conditions for the tissue damage that wet cold caused faster than dry cold. The management of wet clothing was one of the winter's most demanding and least celebrated challenges. Work in snow and cold produced sweat, and sweat saturated the inner layers of wool with moisture that, if not dried before the next exposure to cold, became a thermal liability rather than an asset. Drying wet wool near the fire required a precise calibration of distance and time, close enough to the heat to dry, far enough to avoid scorching, turned and adjusted at intervals to dry evenly, the whole process requiring attention that competed with every other demand on the family's time and energy. Wool that was scorched was damaged, its fibers weakened, its insulating capacity reduced. Wool that was not dried was dangerous. The narrow path between those two outcomes was navigated daily by everyone in the household as a matter of survival. In the monastery, Brother Anselm recorded in his journal the monk's relationship with cold and clothing with the precision of a man whose vocation required him to pay attention to the physical world, even as his theology directed him away from it. The monk's habits, heavy wool robes, designed more for modesty and uniformity than for thermal efficiency, were supplemented in winter with whatever additional layers the monastery's resources permitted. The kale factory, the single heated room, served as the community's drying space, as much as its warming space. The monks' outer garments hung near the fire to dry between the outdoor passages that the daily offices required. Brother Anselm described the warming room in terms that made clear it was the monastery's emotional as well as thermal center in winter, the place where the community gathered, not just to warm their bodies, but to remember, briefly. That warmth was possible, that the cold was not the permanent condition of existence, but a season that would pass. The monks also practiced the warming of beds, though the monastery's version of this was more systematic than the peasant household's heated stone. The kale factory's fire was used to heat flat stones that were then wrapped in cloth and carried to the dormitory, placed in the monks' beds to warm the linen before the night office required them to rise and return to the cold chapel. In the manor house, the Lord's servants performed this service with their own bodies, climbing between the sheets of the Lord's bed and lying there until the linen had absorbed sufficient human heat to be bearable, then withdrawing to their own cold corners of the hall. This practice was not considered degrading or unusual. It was a recognized service, a practical function, the human body deployed as a thermal tool in the same matter-of-fact way that it was deployed for every other form of labor. The night deepened toward its coldest point, and in Aldrich's cottage the fire had reduced itself to the faint orange pulse of well-banked coals, just enough heat to prevent the room from dropping to the temperature of the world outside. The frost had formed on the upper walls in the delicate indifferent patterns that Aldrich would find when he woke, the cold claiming the stone surfaces above the level where human warmth could reach. But in the space immediately around the sleeping pallet, in the air above the 6 human bodies and the 3 animals, in the small volume of the room that their combined metabolisms had claimed against the cold, the temperature held at something that a thermometer would have measured as barely above freezing. Barely above freezing was not comfort. It was not warmth in any sense that a later heated world would recognize, but it was the threshold, the line between the body's ability to maintain its core temperature and the cascade of cold stress that began when that maintenance failed. On one side of that line, people slept and woke and continued. On the other side, they did not. 6 human bodies and 3 animals, arranged by the accumulated wisdom of generations into the most thermally efficient configuration available to them, held that line through the night. The frost crept down the walls above their heads. The fire breathed in its ash. Elspeth's breathing was wet and laboured but present. Perrette slept between her parents with the perfect, trusting stillness of a child who does not yet know what holds the cold at bay. Outside, the January night pressed against the cottage walls with its full, indifferent weight, and the walls held it, and the bodies inside held the walls, and the fragile bubble of warmth that 6 people and 3 animals had made together persisted through the dark hours, improbable, insufficient, by every modern standard, and entirely, stubbornly alive. This was the intimacy of survival, not chosen, not celebrated, not understood as anything other than the simple, necessary fact of winter. Bodies pressed together in the dark, sharing the only heat they had, keeping each other at the threshold where life remained possible. It was the oldest human arrangement, older than the cottage walls that held them, older than the fire that supplemented their warmth, as old as the cold itself, the answer that living bodies had always given to the question that winter asked. Death in medieval winter rarely announced itself with drama. It arrived the way the cold itself arrived, incrementally, patiently, working through the body's defenses, one layer at a time, until there was nothing left to defend. It arrived in the sound of a cough, deepening over days into something wetter and more labored, in the color draining from a face until the skin took on the gray, waxy quality that those who had seen it before recognized immediately, and those who had not would never forget. Margot recognized it on the morning of the 19th day of January, when she brought Elspeth a cup of thin broth and found the old woman unable to rise from her pallet. Not unwilling, unable, her arms trembling with the effort of pushing herself upright before collapsing back against the straw, her breath coming in shallow, effortful pulls that did not seem to deliver enough air for the work they required. The cough, when it came, was no longer the dry, rattling sound of the early winter weeks. It was wet and deep and productive in the way that meant the lungs were filling, that the body's attempt to clear itself was fighting a process it could not reverse. Margot set the broth down carefully and looked at her mother-in-law's face, the grey skin, the sunken eyes, the lips that had taken on a faint bluish cast at their edges, and understood, with the quiet, terrible clarity of someone who has watched this before, what she was seeing. She did not say it aloud. There was no one to say it to who did not already know. The physiological reality of what was happening inside Elspeth's body was not understood in the terms that a later century would use to describe it, but its mechanisms were no less real for being unnamed. The cold had been working on her for months, not the dramatic, immediate cold of freezing, but the chronic, grinding cold stress that begins when a body is required to maintain its core temperature against persistent ambient cold with insufficient fuel to do so. Every hour of every day, through the autumn and into the winter, Elspeth's body had been burning resources to stay warm, resources that a younger, better-fed body might have had in reserve, but that 61 years of hard living and 2 years of famine-reduced diet had left dangerously depleted. The fat stores that the body draws on, first in cold stress, had been minimal since the harvest failures of 1315. The muscle mass that serves as a secondary fuel reserve had been diminishing through months of reduced food and reduced activity. The immune system, suppressed by cold stress and malnutrition in ways that the body's own priorities dictated, warmth before immunity, always, when resources are scarce, had been unable to mount an adequate defense against the infection that had settled into her lungs in November. The infection itself was not a single thing. It was a cascade, bacteria finding purchase in airways already compromised by decades of smoke inhalation, multiplying in the warm, wet environment of lungs that the cold had weakened, producing the inflammation and fluid accumulation that was now making each breath a labor. A later century would call this pneumonia, would treat it with antibiotics that would clear the infection within days, would consider it a serious but manageable illness rather than a death sentence. In January of 1317, in a stone cottage in northern France, it was what it had always been for the old and the weakened in winter, the final argument that the cold made, the one that the body could not answer. Aldrich went for Geneviève. The village healer was not a doctor, in any sense that a later century would recognize, held no formal training, possessed no license or certification, and operated entirely outside any institutional framework of medicine. She was 67 years old, a widow who had outlived 2 husbands and 4 children, and who had spent 4 decades accumulating the empirical knowledge of illness and treatment that was the village's only medical resource. Her knowledge was genuine, built from observation, from the transmitted wisdom of the women who had preceded her in this role, from decades of watching what worked and what did not, from the hard-won understanding that certain interventions helped and certain others harmed, and that the difference between them was not always obvious. She knew which plants reduced fever and which thickened phlegm. She knew the sound of a cough that would resolve and the sound of one that would not. She had heard Elspeth's cough through the wall of the cottage on her way past 2 days ago, and she had not needed to be summoned to know what it meant. She came with her basket, a collection of dried herbs, small clay pots of rendered fat and preserved preparations, strips of cloth for poultices, and she examined Elspeth with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who has learned that rushing an examination produces worse information than taking the time to see clearly. She pressed her ear against the old woman's chest and listened to the sounds inside. The wet crackling that filled both lungs now, the laboured rhythm of breathing that was working too hard for too little result. She felt the temperature of the skin, noted the colour of the lips, observed the way Elspeth's nostrils flared with each breath in the unconscious effort to draw more air. She straightened, and her face told Margot everything before her words did. What Geneviève prescribed was the best that her knowledge and the family's resources could provide, and it was not enough, and she knew it was not enough, and she prescribed it anyway, because doing something was better than doing nothing, and because the something she prescribed was genuinely helpful at the margins, even if it could not address the central problem. Hot broth, made from the bones of a chicken, the family's last laying hen, a sacrifice that represented weeks of future eggs traded for the possibility of a few more days of life. A poultice of mustard powder, mixed with rendered fat, applied warm to the chest and covered with cloth, the mustard's irritant properties drawing blood to the surface and providing a modest counter-irritant effect that could ease the sensation of tightness even if it could not clear the fluid from the lungs. Steam from a pot of boiling water infused with dried thyme, held close to the face to ease the breathing passages. And warmth, as much warmth as could be managed, the fire built higher than the woodpile could really afford. The family's bodies pressed close around the old woman through the day as well as the night. The instruction to keep Elspeth warm was the most important and the most impossible. Everyone in the cottage understood this simultaneously. The gap between the prescription and the available means hanging in the smoky air like the smoke itself, present, pervasive, not to be resolved by any effort available to them. They built the fire higher. They moved Elspeth's pallet closer to the hearth. They piled on her every blanket and piece of cloth in the cottage that was not immediately essential to someone else's survival. They did everything they could, and everything they could was not enough, and this was not a failure of love or effort or intention. It was the arithmetic of poverty and cold, and it did not yield to love. The mortality of medieval winter was not a secret or a surprise to the people who lived through it. It was a known feature of the season, documented in the parish records that survive from this period in the unadorned language of administrative necessity, names, dates, the brief notation of burial fees, paid or waived, the record of a life reduced to a line in a ledger. Those records, where they survive, show a consistent pattern, deaths clustering in the months of January through April, with a peak in the hungry gap of late winter and early spring, when the cold was beginning to relent, but the food stores had run their course, and the new crops were still weeks from harvest. The very young and the very old died in the greatest numbers, their bodies least able to sustain the metabolic demands of cold stress over months. But the middle years were not safe. Men and women in their 30s and 40s died of what the records called the cold sickness, or the lung fever, or simply the winter illness, deaths that a later century would recognize as pneumonia, influenza, the complications of tuberculosis exacerbated by cold and malnutrition. The infections that found entry through skin, cracked by cold and bodies weakened by months of insufficient food. The hungry gap was the season's final cruelty, arriving just when the worst of the cold seemed to be passing. By February, the grain stored from the previous harvest was running low, measured out in diminishing portions, stretched with whatever could supplement it, the family's diet contracting toward the minimum that sustained life, and sometimes past it. The animals that had been kept alive through the winter for their breeding value and their heat were now themselves thin and weakened, their milk reduced, their bodies offering less thermal contribution than they had in November. The preserved foods, the salted meat, the dried beans, the root vegetables stored in the cold cellar were depleted, the variety of the diet collapsing toward the monotony of whatever remained. And the cold, though beginning to moderate, had not yet released its grip. The days were longer, the sun occasionally present, but the nights were still deeply cold, and the ground still frozen, and the wood still burning, and the bodies still demanding more fuel than the food could provide. Father Bertrand moved through this season with the resigned competence of a man whose vocation required him to be present at the worst moments of his community's life. He was 45 years old, thin in the way of men who have never had enough to eat and who have spent decades in cold stone buildings. His cassock, a single layer of wool that was wholly inadequate for the temperatures he moved through on his pastoral rounds. He had learned to perform the sacraments with his hands wrapped in strips of cloth beneath his vestments, the cloth providing marginal warmth that allowed his fingers to maintain enough dexterity to hold the vessels and make the necessary gestures. He had learned to read the faces of families when he arrived at their doors, the particular expression that meant he had been called in time, and the other expression that meant he had not. He came to Aldrich's cottage on the 21st day of January, summoned by the oldest child Thomas, who had been sent running through the cold streets with the urgent, focused expression of a 9-year-old who has been given an important task and understands its importance. Father Bertrand administered the last rites with the careful, practiced movements of long habit, his breath clouding in the cold air of the cottage, his fingers blue at the tips, despite the cloth wrappings. He anointed Elspeth's forehead and hands with the holy oil, spoke the prayers in the Latin that she could not understand, but that she had heard at enough deathbeds to recognize as the sound of the boundary being approached. Her eyes were open and aware, tracking the priest's movements with the focused attention of someone who was using the last of their concentration on something that matters. She was not afraid, or if she was, the fear was contained within something larger, the acceptance that had been built into her by 61 years of a life in which death was not an abstraction, but a neighbor, a seasonal visitor, a presence as familiar as the cold itself. The children were kept at the far end of the cottage during the rites, pressed against the animal partition with the dogs, their faces carrying the careful blankness of children who are processing something large and have not yet found the form for it. Perrette did not fully understand what was happening. Thomas understood completely. Isabel, at 7, understood enough to know that the understanding she had was incomplete, and this partial knowledge was in some ways harder to carry than either ignorance or full comprehension. Elspeth died in the early afternoon of the 22nd day of January, in the grey, flat light of a winter day that offered no drama and no commentary on the event it witnessed. Her breathing, which had been laboured for days, simply became more laboured, and then less laboured, and then stopped, the transition from life to death occurring in the space of a few minutes, with the quiet, undramatic finality of a fire going out. Margot was holding her hand. Aldrich was at the hearth, feeding the fire that could not save her. The dogs, pressed against her legs in their habitual position, did not move for a long time after she stopped breathing, as though they were uncertain whether the warmth they had been providing was still needed, or whether it was now something else entirely. The family's response to Elspeth's death was shaped by the same cold arithmetic that had shaped everything else about their winter. Grief was present, real, felt. The particular grief of people who have lost someone they have lived, pressed against through months of cold, whose body heat has been part of the household's survival, whose breathing has been the night's rhythm. But grief was not the first order of business, because grief did not keep the living warm, and the living required warmth immediately and continuously and without pause for mourning. The body could not remain in the cottage. The cottage was too small, the living too many, the practical requirements of daily survival too demanding to accommodate the presence of the dead alongside the living. Elspeth was moved to the cold storage shed attached to the cottage's exterior wall, a small, unheated space used for preserving food through the winter, where the temperature was reliably below freezing, and where the cold would serve, with grim practicality, as a preservative. She would remain there until the ground could be dug, and the ground could not be dug now. The frost had penetrated to a depth of 2 feet or more, and breaking through it to the depth required for a grave was not a morning's work, but a day's labour involving iron bars heated in fire and driven into the frozen earth. The ground thawed in small sections and then dug, the process repeated until the necessary depth was achieved. Father Bertrand would arrange it when the temperature moderated enough to make the work possible. Until then, the cold that had killed Elspeth would keep her. Her pallet was redistributed before the day was out. The straw was shaken and spread beneath the children's sleeping area, adding a layer of insulation between their bodies and the frozen floor. Her blanket, a heavy wall piece that she had owned for decades, worn thin at the edges but still functional, was given to Perrette, who was too young to understand the transfer's full significance, but old enough to burrow into the warmth of it with the instinctive gratitude of a cold child given something warm. The dogs, deprived of their habitual sleeping position against Elspeth's back, circled the empty space for a time before settling against Isabel, who accepted their warmth with the practical openness of a child who has been taught by everything around her that warmth comes from wherever it can be found. This was not callousness. It was the medieval relationship with death, shaped by a proximity to mortality, that made certain responses not only acceptable, but necessary. The church provided the framework of meaning. Elspeth's soul had departed to its judgment. Her body was a vessel now emptied. The grief of those left behind was real, but secondary to the spiritual reality of what had occurred. The community provided the practical support. Neighbors arrived through the afternoon with small contributions. A bundle of wood from Renaud, a portion of dried beans from the family 2 doors down. The village's collective acknowledgement that a household diminished by death was a household that needed shoring up. And the family provided what families have always provided in the face of loss, the continuation of the necessary work, the maintenance of the fire, the feeding of the children, the small daily acts of survival that do not pause for grief, because grief cannot be afforded when the cold is still present and the woodpile is still finite and the hungry gap is still weeks away. Margot coughed that evening, once, a sound that was dry and brief, and that she covered quickly with her hand. Aldrich heard it from across the room, and did not look up from the fire he was tending. The sound moved through the cottage, and settled into the smoke-thickened air, and remained there, unacknowledged, carrying its weight of implication in silence. Outside, the cold continued its patient, indifferent work. The village's other fires burned in their other cottages, and in each one the same calculations were being performed, the same resources counted, the same bodies pressed together against the same cold. Some of those cottages had already lost someone this winter. Some would lose someone before spring arrived. The parish records would note the names and dates in their unadorned columns, and the community would absorb each loss and continuing, because continuing was what communities did, because the cold did not pause for grief, and neither could the living. The fire needed feeding. The children needed settling into sleep. The night, which did not know or care what the day had taken, was deepening toward its coldest point, and the warmth that 6 bodies had made together was now the warmth that 5 bodies would have to make, and 5 would have to be enough, because 5 was what remained, and what remained was what you worked with, and you worked with it because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not something the living were permitted to do. Aldrich bent the fire with careful hands, covering the coals with ash in the practiced gesture of a man who has performed this ritual through every winter of his adult life. He checked the clay pot, found the coals inside still breathing, replaced the lid. He lay down beside Margot in the dark, and the children arranged themselves around them, and the dogs pressed close, and the animals shifted in their partition, and the cold pressed against the walls from outside, and inside the fragile diminished warmth of 5 human bodies held the line through another night, as it had always held it, as it would hold it again tomorrow, for as long as holding was possible. The first sign was not warmth. It was light, not the grey, indifferent light of deep winter that revealed the world's suffering without softening it, but something incrementally different, a pale gold quality at the horizon in the early morning, lasting perhaps 10 minutes before the overcast swallowed it, but present, unmistakably present, in a way that it had not been in January. Aldrich stood outside his cottage in the last days of February and watched it happen with the focused attention of a man who has learned to read small signs carefully, because small signs were all that the season offered and missing them was a luxury he could not afford. The air was still bitterly cold against his face, still capable of freezing the moisture in his beard within minutes, still the air of a world that had not yet decided to relent. But it carried something, a quality that was not warmth, but was the memory of warmth, the faint suggestion that warmth was a thing that existed somewhere and might, in time, return. He stood with this for a long moment, his breath rising in white clouds, his cracked hands wrapped in the strips of wool that had become as much a part of his winter body as his own skin. Behind him, through the cottage door, he could hear the sounds of the morning, Margot moving at the hearth, the children beginning to stir, the animals shifting in their partition with the restless energy of creatures who sensed the same incremental change in the air that he was sensing. From inside came the sound of Margot's cough, dry still, not yet the wet depth that had marked Elspeth's final weeks, but persistent in a way that had been present for 3 weeks now and showed no sign of resolving. He knotted it as he knotted it every morning, with the careful, controlled attention that did not yet permit itself to becoming the thing it was afraid of becoming. He turned back inside, pulling the door closed against the cold, and the day began as every day of that winter had begun, with the fire, with the counting of what remained, with the arithmetic of survival performed against the backdrop of a season that was, perhaps finally, beginning to tire of itself. The church had provided the structure that made the winter psychologically survivable in ways that the woodpile and the body heat could not address. This was not incidental to medieval winter endurance. It was central to it, the framework of meaning and time that prevented the dark months from collapsing into an undifferentiated grey expanse of suffering. Advent had marked the beginning of the dark season with its own rituals of anticipation, its candles lit against the darkness in a gesture that was simultaneously theological and defiantly practical. Christmas had arrived as a genuine interruption, a feast day that required celebration, even from people who had little to celebrate with, that imposed warmth and community in the deliberate suspension of ordinary misery on a day that the cold had no particular reason to honor. The 12 days of Christmas had stretched the celebration into the deepest cold of January, providing a series of marked days that gave the winter's worst weeks a texture of event rather than mere endurance. Candlemas had come on the 2nd day of February, 40 days after Christmas, and its arrival had been felt in the village as something more than a liturgical date. It was the midpoint of winter by the medieval reckoning, the day when the church blessed candles for the year ahead, when the light returning to the world was acknowledged and celebrated, when the community gathered in Father Bertrand's cold stone church and stood together in the candlelight and felt, collectively, that the worst was past. Whether the worst was actually past was a meteorological question that February's weather would answer with its usual indifference to human hope. But the marking of the day mattered regardless, because the human mind requires narrative structure to endure suffering, requires the sense that time is moving through identifiable stages toward a known destination, and the church calendar provided exactly this, a map of the dark months with landmarks at regular intervals, each one a confirmation that the journey was progressing, that the destination existed. That spring was not an abstraction, but a daton, a calendar that was getting closer with every passing day. The storytelling had been the other instrument of psychological survival, less formal than the church calendar, but no less essential. Through the long winter evenings, when the fire was built up and the work of the day was done, and the family was gathered in the cottage's smoky warmth, the stories came out, the accumulated narrative inheritance of generations, the tales and legends and histories that were the village's collective memory and its primary entertainment simultaneously. Aldrich told stories the way his father had told them, and his father's father before that, not as performance, but as transmission, the passing of knowledge and meaning through the medium of narrative, the winter evenings serving as the classroom in which the next generation received what the previous generation had learned. The children listened with the focused, hungry attention of minds that had no other entertainment, their eyes bright in the firelight, their bodies pressed close in the warmth of the family cluster, the stories carrying them out of the cold cottage and into worlds where summer existed, and heroes prevailed, and the cold was something that happened to other people in other times. The village itself functioned as a survival organism in ways that the individual household could not. The sharing that happened through the winter months was not charity in the modern sense, not the voluntary transfer of surplus to those in need, but something more fundamental and less sentimental. The mutual insurance of people who understood that their individual survival was contingent on the survival of the community around them, that a neighbor who froze or starved was a neighbor who could not help with the spring planting, that the village's collective capacity to endure the winter was a resource that everyone had an interest in maintaining. Renaud's bundle of wood, delivered after Elspeth's death, was not generosity. It was investment, the maintenance of a relationship of mutual dependence that would pay returns through the seasons ahead. The beans from the family 2 doors down were the same calculation performed by people who did not have the vocabulary of economics, but understood its logic with the precision of those for whom the logic was existential. The winter wisdom that made this collective survival possible was not written down. It existed in a community the way all essential knowledge exists in communities that cannot afford to lose it, distributed across the minds of the living, transmitted through demonstration and instruction, and the accumulated experience of watching what worked and what did not, refined through generations of winters into a body of practical expertise that was as sophisticated as any formal system of knowledge, and considerably more immediately useful. Genevieve carried it in her understanding of illness and remedy. Aldrich carried it in his knowledge of fire management and fuel assessment. Margot carried it in her understanding of food preservation and the management of diminishing stores. The old women of the village carried it in their reading of weather signs, the quality of the clouds, the behavior of animals, the particular smell of the air before a storm, knowledge that had no scientific basis but had been refined through centuries of observation into something that was right often enough to be genuinely useful. Which foods preserved through winter and which did not. How to stretch grain stores through the hungry gap by mixing them with dried legumes and root vegetables in proportions that maintained minimum nutrition without exhausting any single resource. How to read the signs in a sick person's breathing that distinguished the illness that would resolve from the one that would not. How to treat frostbitten extremities, not with the heat that instinct demanded, but with the gradual, careful warming that prevented the tissue damage that rapid rewarming caused.